was that bright, eh?
Want a little light on that?
Yeah, just
No.
Everyone's going to be self-introductory today.
I think so.
Dan just says to remind people that they have a new updated Saturday schedule that's down in the cafeteria that's black and white that just has some added stuff and a little bit of rearranged stuff on it. So if you don't have your latest one, I see several people use it up already for the day. It's just an updated schedule.
So in the latest version, this starts at 9:45.
But actually, it was an invisible ink that it said starting at 9:30, but there were parentheses that you couldn't see that said Gun Lake Indian Time.
Oh, okay. All right, we'll go ahead and get started then. Buju, Wabanung Meshe, Kyak Kyak Dijnikaz, Bao Ting Don Jaba, Ajijak and Dodam. My name is Marty Reinhardt. My family's Sault Ste. Marie, Chippewa on this side, and then we're Garden River First Nation on the other side, the imaginary border. And my family's Crane Clan, and I work up at Northern Michigan University in the Center for Native American Studies, and I teach courses on Indian education and treaties, and courses that I'll be teaching one in the fall called Kinomage, The Earth Shows Us the Way. And we look at this kind of stuff, you know, going out and doing the kind of stuff we're doing here, getting food, going and looking at these lines that they separate the treaty boundaries between our tribes and our world. So what I'm going to be talking about today is our food provisions and the treaties between the United States and the Anishinaabe tribes on the U.S. side of the border. This one doesn't cover Canada, but certainly my future studies will be more encompassing. So I anticipate completing a study of all of the 371 or 72 treaties, depending on how you look at it, across the United States, and then also then incorporating Canadian treaties into that. So, but this one focuses on the United States. So I got a question for you. What does intercourse and grubbing hose have in common? Not the question you're expecting at a treaty presentation? Anybody know? So they're both treaty terms. Intercourse and grubbing hose, from the Treaty with the Chippewa of 1855. Article 3, $200 in grubbing hose and tools the present year. You had a dirty mind. Article 7, the laws of which are may be enacted by Congress regulating trade and intercourse with Indians. Let's see. It was a clean joke, right? Clean treaty joke. So Vine Deloria. We read about Vine Deloria a lot in Native American studies, and here's what he had to say about treaties. In 1974, he says, the best way to restore dignity to the tribes is to fulfill the original promises made to the tribes in treaties and agreements of former years. 1974, not much has changed. 1999, before he passed on, he had this to say about treaties. The treaty process is viable and remains the most appropriate, most fair, and certainly the clearest manner in which to identify and demarcate the rights of tribal nations. Smart man. And I completely agree. It's a cornerstone of our relationship with the United States. Here's an old white guy, Thomas, W.I. Thomas. He's an American sociologist. I'm a sociologist, so I kind of like sociologists. I'm biased that way. And he says if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. Now, we could update this and use less sexist language because this was back in the 1920s, right? So if people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. Now, how does that impact our treaty rights? Well, people believe something about treaty rights. One of the things that they believe is that they're outdated, right? People tell me that. They say, oh, those were made back in the 17 and 1800s. How do they apply to today? And then I remind them, so was the U.S. Constitution, made in the 1700s. And last I read the U.S. Constitution and treaties made are the supreme law of the land. So I think if we apply it to one, we have to apply it to all. The other thing that people fail, I think, sometimes to realize is that they think of treaties as applying to Indians, as though Indian people are the ones exercising our treaty rights, but then white people or non-Indians don't have to exercise their treaty rights, when it's actually the opposite. This is our land, right? And they exercise the treaty right to be here. So when they exercise their treaty rights under the state of Michigan DNR regulations to hunt, fish, and gather on our traditional homelands, they're exercising their treaty rights. So it's not just one way. But this focus is on Anishinaabe treaty rights. So I'm going to focus on that today. And of course, the Thomas theorem applies to the canons of treaty construction, which we'll get into later. How do we actually interpret treaties? What do they mean? So the treaty-making era between the U.S. and American Indian tribes lasted between 1778 and 1871. There are 372 treaties, by my count, and 13 supplements with Indian tribes that were ratified by the U.S. Senate. You'll see that that number, 372, sometimes is said 371. So it depends on who you read. I think it's 372 based on my read. So you'll have to determine that yourself. On March 3rd, 1871, the U.S. Congress included a rider in the Indian Appropriations Act prohibiting further treaty making. And so they usurped the presidential powers in the U.S. Constitution by passing this rider in the Appropriations Act, and made it impossible for the president then to enter into further treaties with Indian tribes. And it was one of those constitutional dilemmas. Whenever you have one side of the federal government making it impossible for the other side of the government, the three branches, that's a constitutional dilemma. And so this was one of those dilemmas in our history. So this is the rider. It says essentially here that the president can't do that. They're not going to make any more treaties with Indian tribes. But the other part of that a lot of people don't know is how that rider applies to our fishing rights and other rights associated with our treaty rights. And so this is an important paragraph down here. Such treaties and executive orders and acts of Congress under which the rights of any Indian tribe to fish are secured shall be construed to prohibit, in addition to any other prohibition, the imposition of under any law of a state or political subdivision thereof on any tax on any income derived from the exercise of the right to fish. Essentially, what that means is that we can go out and treaty fish and we don't have to claim income tax. So you know how they have a general tax or general welfare exclusion nowadays? They're talking about the general welfare exclusion for tribal programs for income. You don't have to report it if it's a general welfare exclusion. Well, we already had that kind of an exclusion based on our treaty rights. And so treaty rights-based exclusions from your income tax are very important. Now, one of the things that I will be doing in the near future is going back to 1994 and claiming all of the education that I've either received money for or has used to teach about our Anishinaabe education, our Anishinaabe rights, foraging, hunting. Because I think we have those rights. And we shouldn't have to pay taxes on something that we've always been able to do under treaty. This applies. So I'll let you know how it turns out. The Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi separately or together 72 treaties ratified by the U.S. Senate. That's a lot. 77. I think we have the record as far as tribes with the most treaties. The legacy of these treaties is a mixed bag. Of course, you know, we've had disenfranchisement because of it, you know, and that's not a good thing. In some ways, it was very devastating to us. But I also think it's a cornerstone for the relationship that we have now with the U.S. government. And in some ways, it's more secure than our Aboriginal rights. It's more secure than what we say is our rights of sovereignty. We seem to gain more ground. But we also need to exercise our treaty rights more and secure them better. thing. I'm not sure how many between Sugar Island and Garden River. So here's how Michigan looks when it. You can see that we're down in this area here. Land cession following the Treaty of 1821. Tribe, you know, my wife and I, we live over right here, south of Marquette, on the western border of the 1836 area. And where I work is in the 1842. So that's how Michigan looks when you divide it into the cessions. And here's what Michigan looks like after the land was subsequently turned into the reservation areas, and the area outside the reservations, which they claim to be our treaty ceded areas, where they think we can only exercise our rights of occupancy or our usufructuary rights. So that it's a vast difference, isn't it, when you think about the way they like us to think about this. Ceded areas. Reservations were established by treaty. There's Minnesota in the land cessions. There's Minnesota after the treaties as far as our Anishinaabe reservations. So here's an excerpt. This is from a treaty negotiation in 1820. At the treaty negotiations, and I'm just going to read through this. Through so everybody can, if you can't see it well, you can hear it. At the treaty negotiation, repeatedly suggested that he would resist white settlement, rejected efforts on the part of the federal negotiators to change his position. As the conference drew to a close, Shingwabusin observed one of the federal government's negotiators sitting on a tree stump. Shingwabusin made his way to the same stump and sat very close to the negotiator. When the negotiator moved to another log, the negotiator onto the ground and looking at the way in which you serve your poor. The Great Spirit hears me, and I will speak. I came and asked you for a seat on which to rest my limbs. With this, I urged you for more until you gave. And again, I demanded more until you had none left. Many moons ago, our father crossed the big water, the Atlantic Ocean, and begged of his red children a small piece of land on which he might build his wigwam. It was given him. Not being satisfied, he again asked his red children for more. This was given, and still more, until his red children abandoned the homes and hunting grounds of their fathers to make way for the white man. Now, when the great chiefs and braves of their nations are at rest, our father is for sending us further west to where the sun sets and sinks into the big lake Pacific Ocean. 1820, you know, they're trying to push Anishinaabe people out of our traditional homelands, and we're resisting. So the colorful wording, of course, we have to think about the times and the bias that the people who are writing it, but I think you get the point. So my study methods, I completed a content analysis of all the treaties with the Anishinaabe tribes that were ratified by the Senate. If you ever want to read these treaties yourself, they have a complete list of the ratified treaties at Oklahoma State University. That's that website address there. Or you can just type in Kapler's into your Google search, Kapler's treaties, and it'll bring that up. So the key terms I use, the similar terms, and I also did some conceptual clusters. Some of the examples include food, diet, sustenance, hunt, fish, gather, farm, agriculture, livestock, etc., etc. So food-related terms that you would think are associated with our food as we think about it today. So some limitations from the study. I did not complete a content analysis of non-ratified treaties. There are other treaties out there that were not ratified, but I didn't do a study of those. I also did not use an independent rater or reviewer. This is just my work. So if anyone wants Say the next time, the independent raider was whoever, right? A memology is simply saying I didn't trace back to see how one treaty related to the other treaties. That's yet to work to be. General terms that could arguably encompass the smaller terms, I did not include, even though that they may speak to it in a large. May be land ceded, land reserved, live and occupy. Those are food eating, whatever, but they aren't mentioned food, right? You could also live, but you could say, well, you can't live without food, but you can also live by other means, in reference to other stuff. So you'll see what I'm talking about the more you look into those things. But obviously, these things could apply in a larger context. I also did not include one specific thing that is obviously consuming, but it is the ardent spirits, wines or other liquors in Indian country. So that's something that I didn't include in this, but it actually is in there. So with those limitations, what I found was that there are 50 treaties that were written between the Anishinaabe and the articles. And I broke those down into 4 categories, and I've categorized them into right to hunt, fish, and gather, or similar terms, goods, provisions, and subsistence, and then support for farm and milling, and then this other category. And so you can see how those articles break down in those categories. Our primary provisions were in support for farming and milling, which if you think about the context where I presented a couple months ago, a lot of people forget that we have these treaty rights for farming, for agriculture. On the top one, the right to hunt, fish, and gather. But we also have these other goods and provisions and subsistence and support for farming, and then we also have, it's just one less than right to hunt, fish, and gather. So something you have to be aware of, treaty construction. These are used by the United States Supreme Court when interpreting treaty provisions. And so when we look at these, the highest level of law in the United States, what tests should they be using to look at these? Because we're going to encounter people who are regulating, we're going to encounter people who are interpreting at the tribal council level, we're going to encounter law enforcement officers out in the woods, we're going to encounter in state courts and federal courts at the local district level, the appeals level. Eventually, every treaty case will end up, if you take it far enough, will end up in the Supreme Court. But every lower idea, this is talking about, say the U.S. District Court said, no, that's not what you Indian people have a right to do. Well, they would have to apply the same logic, and if they didn't, when it got to the U.S. Supreme Court, the canons of treaty construction applied as intended. And if they didn't, well, they're going to overturn that case, or they should overturn that case. You never know how that goes. Supreme Court, thank goodness Scaly is not on there anymore. Did I say that out loud? Shouldn't talk bad about the dead, I guess. There's 3 of them, essentially. The first one up here, ambiguities in treaties must be resolved in favor of Indians. Ambiguity. What's ambiguity? Uncertainty. Okay. Anything else? Ambiguity. Okay. More than the meaning is unclear, essentially. Anytime there could be more than one meaning, we have to resolve That's huge. Yeah, it has to be resolved in our favor if it's treaties. The second one is Indian understood them at that time that they were written, right? So we have back then. How do we do that? In time, we can't take a time machine back there. So how do we go about doing that? How do we think like our ancestors thought? How do we know that? That's one area of evidence, right? We can look at our... Any other way?
Historic documents, ethno history.
Okay, some historical documents, like something there to offer, even though it was written by probably a white guy who was biased against us, right? But there's still some stuff we can find in them, right? Anything else? I know this lady sitting behind you has an idea.
Maybe some archaeology.
Oh, archaeological evidence, right? So archaeological evidence. Even though archaeology has been a sticky point for Indian people, there are good uses of archaeological evidence, right? As long as they're not grave robbing. To find some it's a good thing. What about our languages? Right? You kind of said technology of our language, our language. How do we say these things? You know, how do we talk about? Because those words, we can actually look back at the etymology and determine, is that a post-contact word or is that a pre-colonial difference is just looking at our own language, and that has a lot of meaning for us. Ancestors might have actually meant at that time. That's important. Treaties must be construed liberally in favor of the Indians. That means that only Bernie Sanders can... I'm a little biased, can you tell? Okay, so Indian treaties must be construed liberally. So that means if there is... It's possible where you can get 1 year or 100 years. If it's something it says $20,000 and as much hereafter as Congress thinks appropriate, right? $1,000 plus, however long that extends out, until they can absolutely show us that Congress, for a fact, no longer intended. You know, ways that we can determine that. Really, the only way for Congress to show that they don't intend to do something is to pass a law. That's important for us to think about. So this is the way the U.S. Supreme Court should be interpreting our treaty rights. And we need to think, we need to guess about, you know, here in this area, you know, I know these folks are thinking about how does minutes here. Yes. Yes. Absolutely, yeah. We were just having and you know, again, there's a sticky relationship, right, between Native people and anthropologists, archaeologists primarily, because of grave. Strike a balance. What's the kind of good knowledge that we can gain? You know, like this gentleman here yesterday was talking about how we have over in Wisconsin, they've determined the sediment levels include wild rice as a base for establishing good agriculture, right? And I'm not explaining it as well as you did, but nonetheless, that's important information for us. And they didn't have to rob a grave to do that, right? So that's information that can help us reestablish our link to agricultural treaty provisions and help grow our economies today. So yeah, absolutely. So here court, this is the Fox decision. This is from the Cora website. And he was applying the canons of treaty construction to the Treaty of 1836, and regarding the idea of the right to hunt and fish in our Great Lakes. So this is a quote from his findings in this case. Because of the documented evidence demonstrating the Indians were absolutely dependent upon fishing for subsistence for their livelihood, and regarding the treaty as Indians would have understood it, they would not have relinquished their right to fish in the ceded waters of the Great Lakes. So that's an important finding. Since the treaty does not contain language granting away the prior right to fish, that right remains with the Indians and was confirmed by the 1836 treaty. So in that case, the judge said, unless there's evidence showing that we absolutely gave it up, we didn't, we retained it. It's a retained right and solidified by the treaty then. So that was an important finding. And in my opinion, it was really good for Indians at the time. I think we can even infer more if we look back and now say, well, what else was in there that we could have argued? You know, early in the 70s, there was a lot of young lawyers and a lot of young Indians who knew we had the rights, but it wasn't really established what exactly those rights were. And people didn't know how to argue well the canons of treaty construction. We lost a major court case with the University of Michigan back then, you know, in the late 70s. That was actually gave rise to the Michigan Indian tuition waiver. Not part of this presentation, but if you ever want to talk about that further, I'm glad to talk about that too. So some of the other important court cases that we've seen regarding our treaty rights in the Anishinaabe territories. 1971, People versus Jondro. Jondro decision ruled that William Jondro and Keweenaw Bay Indian community have treaty fishing rights. So that was found in our favor. 72, Gurno versus Wisconsin. How many people from Wisconsin here? This is an important case coming out of Wisconsin. Ruled in favor of the Bad River and Red Cliff tribes fishing rights in Lake Superior. That was an important case. In 1976, Big Abe LeBlanc. That's a big guy if you ever met him. Michigan versus LeBlanc. Arrested while fishing with gill nets offshore Bay Mills. Prosecuted in state court, convicted of fishing commercially without a license with using an illegal device. So, you know, when we talk about individuals going out and testing the waters, literally, you know, Big Abe did it. He wasn't waiting for any tribe or any government to tell him he could. He just went out and said, I'm going to treaty fish. As an individual, I have this right, and he went out and did it. 1979, the U.S. versus Michigan, we just talked about that, ruled that the 1836 treaty reserved the right to hunt and fish under tribal authority in a treaty-ceded Great Lakes waters. 1983, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit Court ruled in favor of the Lakota Ray Band in a ruling now known as the Voigt decision. That was LCO 1. The Supreme Court refused to hear an appeal. And so there are subsequent, was it LCO 8 now, I think? So there's a number of LCO subsequent hearings that have gone on. This is just the first one. 1997, a 3-judge panel of the 8th Circuit Court Appeals upheld a federal district ruling affirming the 1837 treaty rights of the Ojibwe. That's known as the Mill-Lax decision. That was further upheld in 1999 by a U.S. Supreme Court ruling. All of these cases eventually bubble up, it seems, to the Supreme Court.
Marty?
Yes?
The last, most recent decision on the query had to do with the night hunting, where the state of Wisconsin authorized night hunting for CDC and for wolf hunting at night, implemented it after telling the tribes it was unsafe to do that. The tribe went back in, reopened up the Voigt decision and said, if the state's managing it and safe, how come we can't exercise that? And the courts ruled in favor of LCO and established a night hunt provision.
Yeah. So shining, and, you know, I have some buddies up at KBIC. When they heard that, they were like, okay, man, I got to get the brightest light available. They were like looking at the halogens and stuff. So, yeah, it's you know, it's one of those things where we keep testing the waters and we keep moving forward, and we got to keep asserting our rights. And that's the example of that. Another example is in 2015. Phil Belfie and myself and 5 other people, we entered a lawsuit against the state of Michigan for trying to sell 10,000 acres of public land to Greymount Mining Corporation, the Canadian mining corporation. This is quote-unquote public Michigan land, but it's treaty-ceded territory land, and it actually is right next door to my wife's community, the Mackinac Band, St. Ignace area. And so he's trying to sell this land for a limestone quarry, right? So we entered a lawsuit. We have subsequently been dismissed for lack of standing under the consent decree. So the consent decree was between the state of Michigan and the tribes in the Cora, the 1836 treaty ceded area. And so they're saying that we have no standing as individuals, that we have to be tribes in order to have standing. And of course we keep saying, no, we have rights. We have treaty rights that we exercise. In fact, I've never seen a tribe exercise a treaty right, only individual citizens of a tribe. I don't know, the last time I went out and foraged or hunted and fished and gathered, I didn't see a tribal government out there hunting, fishing, and gathering. That was me and my cousins, or me and my friends. It was probably Lee. So that's an important case, and we're going to take that maybe to the Supreme Court. We're going to appeal it up. And I'll tell you guys here right now, I'm suing my tribe. My next case is I'm going to sue the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians for neglecting to take and stand up for our treaty rights. Winona LeDuc and Bob Shimmick over at the Indigenous Farming Conference, they reminded us that we have treaty rights and how they differ from property rights. Property rights, when you're suing about property rights, you have to sue after the fact. You have to have an infringement on your property, then you sue for damages. Treaty rights, we can sue before the damage happens. So what does that mean? If they're saying that we as individuals can't sue because of standing, and the tribes can sue, well then that leaves us with little else but to say, you know what, tribes? It's your responsibility. Sue their ass. Stop this from happening. Stop line 5 from rupturing under the Mackinac Straits. Right? If they have that standing, use it. But they fail to use it. Why? We have our suspicions. They say that the tribes aren't doing it because there has to be consensus among all the tribes. Well, if we applied that same logic to gaming, we'd never do any gaming, would we? You guys, I think you're probably aware that the tribes are a lot of infighting between gaming tribes. They never have consensus. So why can't they move forward if they don't have consensus on the environment? What's the difference? Junia, kiche junia. Okay, so let's have some fun, real quick here. This is like treaty nerd fun. So here's the treaty with the Ottawa, etc., 1821, of major consequence to this land that we're visiting here today, or that we live on, if you're from here. This is from the preamble of the treaty with the Ottawa, etc. Articles of a treaty made, concluded at Chicago, State of Illinois, between Lewis Cass, Salmish Sibley, Commissioners of the United States, and the Ottawa, Chippewa, and Potawatomi nations of Indians. Let me ask you this. Is there any ambiguity in this preamble? Ambiguity. Any ambiguity in this?
Are Lewis Cass and Solomon Sidley commissioners of the United States?
Yeah, we'll give them that. They were. They tended to wear several hats, and that's how they confused us. They might have been a priest, but they might have also been a commissioner. They might have also been a lawyer. They might have also been a regent at one of the schools. But in this case, the federal government ratified it, so they've recognized that, in fact, they are commissioners. We'll give them that. Any other guesses about ambiguity here? What tribe controls this Jichak? This Jichak Kino Mage Gomek? Potawatomi. Yeah. So, in this, they are the Potawatomi, right?
Great.
Potawatomi. We could say that in fact, the Machipiнаchuish Gun Lake Band of Potawatomi today is in fact this, right? Would you all agree that they have standing as that? But what about this Chippewa and Ottawa here? How does that relate to this? Do they all share this? Sweat.
Yes.
Yeah. Sweat. Escode. Escode. Right? 3 fires. In the treaty-making era, we were always, in our perspective, 3 fires. Chippewa, Ottawa, Potawatomi. That's why you see these. They use treaties to try to divide us. So when we look at the ambiguity in our identity, that can advantage us. We can actually say, this is not limited to 1 band or 3 bands. This is a 3 fires treaty. We need to maximize the idea. The most liberal definition, right? The 3rd canon of treaty construction. Use the most liberal definition. Then the most liberal definition is all Anishinaabe. That's what we should be saying here. We shouldn't be following these really narrow definitions of how the U.S. government in the state of Michigan would like to apply it to us. Because if it was up to them, it would be 1 tribal chairperson of 1 band. And as soon as that person dies, that's it. You know? No, we need the most liberal definition. So you got to watch even the preambles. The preambles hold a lot of ambiguity of identity. And it tells us who really can or should be exercising their treaty rights. It is, yes.
And so it has a lot of meaning.
That's right.
And trying to get Anglo legal systems to accept metaphor problematic.
It is. Well, and that's why we need people who have an understanding of our identity. They should be interpreting it. And that's why the Indian meaning has to come from our people at that time. Who better to know that than us? Right? We need to help them understand what that actually means. And that doesn't mean the federally recognized 3 bands of Potawatomi in the 1821 treaty ceded area. That means Anishinaabe, Anishinaabe, right? Plural, 3 fires.
I think the concept is balkanization, which is the separation of entities into individual groups with their own self-interest, either competing or not competing, but indifferent to each other sometimes.
That's right.
And when you think about it, that's what they did to us. But look at the United States, what if they were balkanized, 50 states going in different directions, right? So there's strength in unity. So this was by design to break up our unity and our strength as a people. And I just heard a phrase this morning that I just have to repeat about the Canadian treaties. When they talked about their peoples up there, they said we have 1 bowl and we have 1 spoon.
Nice.
We all share and eat here together. So our brothers from Potawatomi here should be able to come up north like we did. My
Yeah.
father, I was trapped up in the Pitcher River Valley up that way. Okay?
That's right. Yeah.
We traveled from here to the north, from the south, from the gardens. And all that, then we were balkanized, which is a new term, but I think it accurately reflects what happened to people.
Yeah. That's what happened when Spock came here. We got vulcanized. Not making light of that, but yeah, exactly.
If you can really speak loud, because the mic for the camera feed is up there, and or
Yeah, I can repeat that,
or
sure.
kind of re-comment on what he just said, so that the listeners out there that are watching this morning can know what's going on. We had it just kind of like a gap where there's nothing, and he was watching.
Yeah, so Lee, brought up a good point about balkanization. The idea of the disunification of the Anishinaabe because of the goals of the United States and the states that make up the United States. Their goal has always been to disenfranchise us from our traditional homelands. And so the more that they can drive a wedge here or there and split us up, divide and conquer. That was the mentality, and that's still the mentality. They don't want to recognize this unity. They don't want this ambiguity to be resolved in our favor. That's up to us to prove. And in order to do that, one spoon, 1 bowl. The idea that was shared this morning with Lee, we know we need a reunification. We need to assert our identity as 3 fires. We need to span state and international borders, and we need to represent ourselves at United Nations. That's who we are. And so we have to reassert that, and we have to claim that. We can't let them keep identifying us. We have to do that. So here is one that I think is very important, and this is the treaty provision in Article 4 of the 1821 treaty. A person to instruct the Ottawas in agriculture and in the purchases of cattle and farming utensils. So does anyone help the Machipanatuish do agriculture? Is Kevin here? No? So Kevin Finney might actually be a treaty right. Has anyone ever thought about Kevin as a treaty right? But he is, in fact, a treaty right. Who pays Kevin's salary? Machipanatuish. Now, did they apply for a grant to pay his salary? Is that federally funded? Is that a federally funded position? Or a state funded position? Or is that a tribally funded position? So think about the context now. If the tribe is funding their own people to instruct them in agriculture, yet they have treaty rights from the federal government to provide people to instruct them in agriculture, shouldn't really the federal government be ponying up the cash to pay Kevin? Not saying that Kevin should lose his paycheck anytime soon from the tribe, but think about the context here.
But they could also state that we abrogated the treaty right by not going to them for that and did it on our own. I mean, they construct their minds that way.
Oh, they absolutely do. Yeah. So, you know, whenever they fail to implement the treaties as we understood them, it's up to us to call them on it. You know, Machipanatuish should reassert that anyone who is helping the Machipanatuish do this agriculture really is a treaty right. And we should expand that. Most liberal definition, right? Ambiguities must be resolved in favor of Indians. Most liberal definition, as we understood it at the time. And if you go back, I can guarantee you, people like Kevin, people who are out there helping clear the land and raise vegetables and all these things, they were what we considered to be helping us do this. We should reassert that. So that's a huge one, you know, especially when we're talking about cash economies, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit, another presentation. Here's the one I think that folks are most interested in, what I'm hearing, is the right of Indians to hunt upon the land ceded. So this is one of those hunt, fish, gather. You know, hunt upon the land ceded. So Bob Shimmick over at the Indigenous Farming Conference, he made a good point, and I said this yesterday during the climate discussion. You know, when we ceded the territory, our understanding, and you can find this in the negotiations, is that we were reserving these lands, the reservations, for our people. Reservations were for our people. And that's because we were protecting special areas, graveyards. We were protecting graveyards, but we were also protecting sugar bushes. We were also protecting wild rice fields. You know, we were protecting those things which were very vital to our lifestyles. That's what reservations were as we saw them. The off-reservation area was occupied territory. That's the area where we did everything else. We never said we're going to be confined to reservations and only come off the reservation when we need to go to town, right? Or we need to go shoot a deer over there. That's not what we said. What we said is that we'll allow you non-Indian people to occupy it with us. But we never gave it away. It was not something that we said we're never going to live as we've lived for thousands of years. That's an absurd notion. So when people think about the occupied or the rights of occupancy, it's not the rights of occupancy one way. We allowed non-Indians to occupy the territories that we were occupying. So it's not that we have to, you know, we should not have to ask to go out and do the things that we've always done. And the idea of mining corporations and oil corporations being able to have more rights on our land than we do, that's crazy. So we really have to think about what it means to have on-reservation and off-reservation rights. And we have to expand on this idea and think about it the way our ancestors would have thought about it, not the way that they would like us to think about it. You know, the whole reservation mentality, you know, where we're confined to a certain locale. You know, as we were talking about yesterday, you know, in the climate discussion, you know, with climate change comes changes in our ability to eat. And if our people were here, our traditional ancestors, if they were here today, they might actually be thinking about moving a bit. You know, think about the Anishinaabe moved from the St. Lawrence Seaway on the eastern coast of the United States and Canada to the Great Lakes region. And one of the things that really impacted their move was wild rice. When they got here, they knew they had found wild rice in this area, and it was an important resource for them. And some people would say it was a prophecy food. That's how important these foods are. So as we move often for food. Climate change impacts our food patterns. It's important that we be able to adapt to those things. But I can guarantee you the United States and Canada don't want us to be moving our reservations, right? They don't want how many Anishinaabe today, you know, a couple 100,000 all of a sudden getting up and saying, okay, now we're gonna go relocate to, I don't know, James Bay. But shouldn't that be our prerogative as the Three Fires Confederacy? We've done it before. It was our right of sovereignty then. Why wouldn't we retain the right to migrate now? To expand our territory, to move our territory, to honor the relationships that we had with other tribes. That's never been something that we gave up, but they'd like us to think so.
Martin,
Yeah.
we're about an hour on.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Half left, so-
Okay. So, usufructuary rights as they are talked about. Yeah, Todd.
I wanted to go back one slide. I've been doing some research on this. Is this referring to 1795 Article 5?
Treaty of Greenville.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It goes on in Article 7. I mean, we take the most liberal definition, right? It says, tribes of Indians, parties to this treaty shall be at liberty to hunt within the territory and lands which they have now ceded to the United States without hindrance or molestation, so as long as they demean themselves peaceably and offer no injury to the people of the United States. It doesn't say it's got to be property of the United States.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, that's a lot of times, oh, we don't have, it's no longer federal property, so there's no, there's no place for you to do this. This doesn't, in 1795, it just says you're allowed to do it in this territory peaceably.
That's right.
Private land, don't
Yeah.
matter.
The territory as we defined it. And that's important because if you think about it today, we'll talk about it in a second, privatization, whether that's individually owned property or public lands that are, have been deemed for another purpose of not hunting, fishing, or gathering, right? So a lot of things that they can throw in our way that we should be saying, no, it doesn't say that.
Right.
We should be able to still hunt, fish, and gather on private property. That's a big issue, right? Because there are a lot of farmers around here, I imagine, that don't want you back on their, their farm gathering or hunting,
For sure.
right? So, that's a real big issue that is, of course, it'll come to a boiling point, and undoubtedly they're going to want compromise. And so that's why we have this consent decree. The last big push for exercising our treaty rights in ceded territory in Michigan. So when the courts look at what they call usufructuary rights, these are the kind of things that they've been talking about. As far as hunting, fishing, and gathering and wild ricing in territory ceded, the use of contemporary technology is not prohibited. That was established. We argued for that if our ancestors had come up with a car headlight to use for shining or for spearing, well, then we would have used it. We can't be trapped into our technology that we had 200 years ago. We have to have the ability to utilize contemporary technology, just like anyone else. Imagine if we said to non-natives, you can only use the technology your ancestors had 200 years ago. It wouldn't be right. So, the species of animals and plants are also not limited. So I'm a big proponent of indigenous food, but that doesn't mean that I don't have a treaty right to go out and get salmon and smelt. Those are not indigenous fish species, but I should have the right to go get them. They're in my territory. They are a food species. It's my right. It's not limited to subsistence activity only. That's why we have commercial fishermen. That's why we should be able to do commercial agriculture. And there's no seasonal limitations imposed. That should be based on how we see it. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the rights are still intact and that the question is how to best manage those treaty resources, right? So the Anishinaabe, we had our own way that we managed. And of course now we have DNR and we have U.S. Fisheries and Wildlife and we have these other agencies that think they know how to best manage. And so they try to impress those things on us. But they're still learning like we are. And they're learning how to adapt to these changing things in our climate. So, in fact, I think our traditional ecological knowledge is sometimes better suited to deal with these changes. And then what's the process for reparations or resources when these things are diminished by non-tribal entities? What happens when they destroy our rice beds with their wave runners? What happens when they clear the land? Someone was talking about, I think here in the Gun Lake area, they're talking about destroying these rice beds so that people can prettify their docks. I mean, isn't that sad? Talking about destroying food so that they have this beautification, quote unquote, beautification of their land. And then when there's disagreements between the states and tribes, the U.S. Supreme Court has said that those need to be adjudicated in the federal court system. And so that's an important piece of that too. Who is representing tribes in the federal systems?
Don't we have federal courts as tribes? It doesn't say U.S. federal court.
Yeah, we have our own tribes, our own courts.
We have a big issue because if you have a treaty between two parties that are sovereign, it is principally unjust for one of those parties to a treaty to adjudicate all the issues of the treaty.
Oh.
In other words, maybe we should have 250 years of our courts interpreting the treaties.
That's right.
And if we're not sovereign, then the treaty isn't valid. There's a process called the rescission, which is the conditions that were enforced before the treaty was entered into are enforced now. There's contract law, treaty law, there's contract law. So I believe that right now there needs to be an international court system to adjudicate issues between equal sovereigns. It is fundamentally unjust for one of those sovereigns to adjudicate those issues unilaterally.
Absolutely. So just to repeat that, the idea that our cases have been heard essentially by the party that has infringed upon our rights is unjust. And we should have an opportunity to have a third party or to address it from our own perspective, just like they have. So that's an important part of what it is that we're dealing with here today. So some of those major things that are happening that are also impacting our ability to exercise our treaty rights, deforestation is huge. If you look at what was going on here in 1620, 1850, and today, they said a squirrel could cross the North American continent never touching the ground back when Europeans first arrived here, right? So I'm not sure how they do that across the plains, but maybe they flying squirrels. But obviously, there were some pretty thick forests. And if you look at what's left today, it's very sad. Every day I go to work up in Marquette and I pass these logging trucks and they're all taking it off public land, quote unquote public land, right? And then the private landowners, the people who have a lot of money that can buy this land, they're also deforesting in a time when we shouldn't be deforesting. So we have to think about what's our take on these sales of timber on these public lands. We should be speaking for those creatures, those beings who don't get a chance to speak. Those trees don't get a chance to speak, but we can speak for them. So privatization and limited public use, you can see how much of the area in Marquette County where I live, how much of it, these are still the public lands, and look at how much has been privatized. I'm sorry, this is the public lands. Look at how much has been privatized throughout there. So our ability to exercise our treaty rights, it's very checkerboarded. So in one place you're able to exercise, then you can step over, and then you can't, and then you're back on treaty ceded territory that you can exercise, just like reservation lands, all checkerboarded. So industrialization, urbanization, commercialization. Here's the mining going on out of cliffs. Here's the Eagle mine where they had the standoff. This is the Marquette area here, the city of Marquette. There's the dump. This is the kind of stuff that we have to deal with when we're exercising our treaty rights in Marquette County. And of course, climate change. The kind of stress that's being put on the species. Look at the changes that are constantly happening in the Great Lakes region. The change in Lake Superior. When we were going through this winter, we kept waiting for the lake to freeze. Didn't happen. I don't know if it ever did. Did anyone know? Did Lake Superior? It didn't freeze over this year. Didn't even come close to what it did last year. So we have to deal with that as well. I know we're pretty close to the time, so if there's maybe one or two questions or comments, and then we'll move on.
Can I say something?
Sure.
I'm from Ontario, Canada, so we're on the other side of the Great Lakes. And I've lived around the Great Lakes all my life, from Lake Erie to Lake Superior. And we were talking a little bit earlier with you about that one dish, one spoon concept. That's our treaty for the area that we live in among our nations. So it's among the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe people in that was intertribal. That we all agreed to live with and share resources. We had the fur trade came in there and created big havoc for us in that region. But sitting here listening for the last few days, and I'm thinking that there is so much that we should be talking about between that, ignoring that line between Canada and the U.S. I just feel like we are relatives, I'm part of the J Treaty, so I have relatives on both sides. But I think we all do. And we get separated by the United States and Canada. I really think that we should try to do some more international work. We have Three Fires represented over in Canada as well. And we have stories from our elders about when they left that St. Lawrence region and came from the Great Lakes to the Lake of the Woods and then all the way to the Rocky Mountains in Alberta. And there's Ojibwe people in Alberta holding teachings that came from that migration. So there's some amazing resources that we're not sharing. Because they talk about those treaties, those people talk about remembering what they intended in those treaties.
Yeah. So yeah,
It'd be nice if we could cross that boundary.
absolutely. We got to figure out ways to reunify across those boundaries that they're trying to set in place for us. When these treaties say Anishinaabe, Chippewa, and Potawatomi, it does not say just the Chippewa and Potawatomi in the United States.
I went and looked at the lake, I didn't see that line, between the two areas. And just because humans have this abstract ability to discern a line, when animals don't use it, birds don't use it, the wind doesn't use it, the rocks don't use it, and we think we're superior beings because somehow we limit ourselves to like some imaginary line that honestly I've never seen it on the ground. The closest I've seen is a little cross at four corners.
Yeah.
That's the most I've ever seen of a boundary. So it's on a map. And you have to understand that the founding fathers of the United States were cartographers, map makers, surveyors. That ability to abstract and draw your land and put a line on it and says it's their land, that is a very odd ability. And I'm beginning not to believe it. Again, I went and checked the lake and I didn't see that line.
Yeah. Well, and good point that Lee's making. Those animals, they don't know, they don't see that line. They go back and forth. Unfortunately, if we had an oil spill in the Mackinac Straits, that oil is not going to see that line either. That's going to impact our Anishinaabe people on the other side of the border just as much as it's going to impact us here in the U.S. Todd, and then I think we need to move on.
I was going to ask, I was talking to you this morning, Marty. You work as a professor, you're with the youth in the Northern Michigan University. What's your with the youth, change is coming. I mean, the youth are inspired on these issues. If you would, I mean, can you just give kind of what you see the path forward, where things are headed with even, non-Anishinaabe?
Yeah, so Todd's asking, what is it that I'm seeing in the classroom? I teach Native American Studies at Northern Michigan. Probably 70-80% of our classes are non-Indian most of the time. And, I can tell you this, across our campus, besides the campus Republicans, everyone's wearing Bernie stickers. That tells you something. Young people see that the environment is what they have to do. They have to focus on the environment. They have to save this planet. We have to help them. And that's what they're all talking about. The youth are energized about their relationship with the Mother Earth. The hipsters, the native students, the biology, I mean, across campus, they all care about this. And I think there's a big disconnect between politics and the youth in the United States. And
I've run into a few people down here that tell me, if Trump gets elected, they're not gonna bring to Canada.
you're all moving to Canada. Okay, I think that's it. Miigwech for you guys for coming to this part. We do have other presenters, and we're going to move on now. Watch the cords.
Thank you.